Great powers, empires that expand their influence well beyond their own borders, tend to be larger states with strong governments and centuries of diplomatic gravitas to draw upon. In Europe in 1740, they were France, Great Britain, Russia, and the Austrian Habsburg domains under the Holy Roman Emperor, but a new state was about to make itself known. The Kingdom of Prussia had none of those great power attributes, but still within just over a century it would dominate all of Germany, which just begs the question, how did Prussia transform itself from irrelevancy to great power status? Well, it was a top-down situation that combined the rational ideals of the Enlightenment with unquestionable autocracy. In the 18th century, parliamentarism was a rarity. Powerful states were mostly led by powerful monarchs who headed influential dynasties. The House of Hohenzollern inherited the then Duchy of Prussia in 1618, which would make up about half of their later kingdom, the other parts being the electorate of Brandenburg in the Holy Roman Empire, as well as half a dozen or so scattered smaller German territories and a sliver of Switzerland. Berlin, in Brandenburg, was the effective capital. Frederick II, Frederick the Great, Prussia's most influential king, ruled from there, but he wasn't its first absolute monarch. The Hohenzollerns had been working to consolidate their possessions for a century before Frederick. His great-grandfather redirected power from the feudal nobility to himself as he rebuilt after the 30 Years' War, and achieved Ducal Prussia's independence from the King of Poland, though West Prussia remained Polish until later in Frederick the Great's reign. Next, his grandfather, Frederick I, upgraded the family's status from dukes and imperial electors to king in Prussia, and his father, Frederick William, the so-called soldier king, dedicated his life, and quite a bit of money, to building up Prussia's already formidable army. What he did not do was invest in culture. He had a deeper dislike for French court traditions than the norm across most of Europe, and derided intellectualism and the arts as unmanly. His son, on the other hand, spoke French with a relish, played the flute, and corresponded regularly with the continent's greatest thinker, Voltaire. Obviously, they clashed. The lowest point was when an 18-year-old Frederick tried to flee to Britain. He was caught, and his friend, accomplice, and possible lover, Hans von Katte, was beheaded in front of him on Frederick William's orders. He did run the kingdom well enough, though, and when Frederick William died 10 years later, Frederick the Great inherited Prussia with a well-maintained treasury and a disproportionately large army. It also had no real international reputation, no real cultural identity of its own, and was seen as just a sideshow to the imperial Habsburg dynasty. Unlike his predecessors, though, Frederick had no respect for the Holy Roman Empire, and knew very well that only the directly controlled Habsburg lands truly answered to Vienna. To him, the empire wasn't a titan but a target, so when Emperor Charles VI was controversially succeeded by his daughter Maria Theresa just months into Frederick's reign, he decided to put the army his forefathers had left him to good use. The War of the Austrian Succession was a Europe-wide conflict between Maria Theresa's Habsburg domains and her allies against Austria's enemies. Frederick was in the latter camp, and his conquest of Silesia during the war was probably his most impactful military victory. But the campaign actually started off rather poorly, and Frederick fled from his very first battle at Mollwitz, an experience that would humble him for the future. By his own admittance, he owed the battle's victory entirely to his father's army. Austria got in more trouble as Frederick's French and Bavarian allies ran amok in Habsburg Bohemia, which gave him the opportunity to stab them in the back, concluding a treaty with Maria Theresa that saw Silesia ceded to him in 1742. Once the Austrians had dealt with the French, though, they came back at Prussia with a vengeance. Far from running away, as in 1741, the 1745 battles of Hohenfriedberg and Soor prove the power of Frederick's cold, analytical style of leadership. In the first, he launched an early morning surprise attack, split the Austrians from their Saxon allies, and smashed them. In the second, the Austrians tried a similar ploy against him. Despite being outnumbered 2-1, tactful use of cavalry saw Prussia inflict nearly twice as many casualties as it suffered. Acquiring Silesia was a game-changer. It was the largest expansion made by the Hohenzollern dynasty to that point, increasing Frederick's subjects by 50% and his state revenue by a third. Frederick the Great, though, was not the sort to rest on his laurels. His Prussia grew strong by putting pragmatism and unrelenting unsentimentality over tradition. Frederick William's strict state Protestantism was replaced by leniency for different Christian denominations. The king himself wasn't really religious at all. For the standards of the time, free speech in pursuit of the advancement of knowledge was encouraged. Frederick also reinvigorated the Berlin Academy, offering financial rewards to those who could come up with theories addressing unsolved questions of the day. The writings of Immanuel Kant, for example, would have seen him exiled or worse in most of Europe. Frederick applied a code of ethics reminiscent of the ancient ideal philosopher-king, seeing himself less as an absolute monarch appointed by God, as was pre-Enlightenment tradition, and instead as the personification of the state, to which he had a responsibility to govern as a good provider would his household. First and foremost, that meant defense. Even with Silesia, Prussia was small, and Maria Theresa would have certainly retaken the province if she could have. Between the end of the War of the Austrian Succession and the start of the 7 Years' War, Frederick doubled the size of Prussia's armed forces. His friend Voltaire dubbed it the army with a state. That came in handy when he found himself at war with 3 powers simultaneously. Those years, the 7 Years' War, were probably the worst of his life. Frederick's armies had no choice but to go from bloodbath to bloodbath, fighting for their very survival. Berlin itself was looted by Austrians and Russians twice. Prussia should have been crushed, and it probably would have been under a different commander. In 1762, though, Frederick was saved. The death of the Russian Empress and the succession of the German Peter III saw the coalition opposing Frederick collapse. With peace, he lost not a scrap of territory, and while his refusal to negotiate earlier saw the deaths of many of Prussia's best, even his victories were costly, it cemented its place as the newest great power in Europe. Aside from prized Silesia, Frederick's other major territory grab was West Prussia from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1772. Working with his former enemies to their mutual benefit, he arranged for the first partition of Poland, and without a shot being fired, Frederick became king of virtually all of historical Prussia. His status as an enlightened despot is well earned. By the end of Frederick's reign, the Berlin Academy rivaled institutions in Paris and London, and while his forefathers had all been military men, Frederick the Great was also a skilled diplomat, a callous one, an intellectual, and a strong proponent of rule of law in a time when crime and punishment was usually just left to a monarch's whims. But in regards to Prussia's rise, Frederick's absolute authority was just as important as his Enlightenment ideals. Constitutionalism, limits on a monarch's power, were anathema to him, and he looked down on Prussia's peasants, most people, until his dying day. It was Frederick the Great's successors who built on his legacy and put Prussia at the center of the German Empire. To find out how its enigmatic chancellor Otto von Bismarck, a disciple of Frederick's school of cold pragmatism, controlled the ever-German states, you should really check out the video on that empire to the left. And as always, I've been James, and hopefully I'll see you there.